Okay then, brethren, if you were with us last week, you'll remember we started looking at the book of Esther. And I introduced the topic by saying that probably, if you're like most people, certainly like me, you would probably quite like to see God's hand in your life, preferably visibly, that you'd see perhaps a sign or a wonder or a miracle. But let's face it, most of us don't actually see that. We would like to, but we don't. And sometimes, now and then, we might wonder, is God really involved in my life at all? Is he anywhere? Is he perhaps working behind the scenes? And of course, that's where the book of Esther came in, as we saw last week, because here's a book in the Bible, the book of Esther, and yet the name God doesn't appear. Nobody refers to God or the Lord, what, in a book in the Bible? Well, how can that be? And yet it's clear as we go through the story of Esther that God is very definitely involved, but you don't see him. He's working, as it were, behind the scenes. And what we do see is a lot of rather remarkable, strange coincidences, things that just happen to come to pass. And it's not like there's one or two or three, there's probably 15, 20 or 25 remarkable coincidences. Far too many for just pure chance, for good luck. And what I think we're seeing there is that God is orchestrating events almost invisibly. You don't see him directly, but it's pretty obvious from the story that God is there. There's just too much happening that is just too convenient, right? Now, quick resume. The story is set way back round about 480 odd BC. The Jews in the story of Esther were in exile. They'd been exiled about maybe 100 years earlier. The exile technically was over, and a number of Jews had gone back to Jerusalem, people like Ezra, and a few tens of thousands, but not honestly very many. I think that might have been wrong in their part, but most average day-to-day Jews were quite comfortable living in the Persian Empire. It was fairly peaceful. They had good jobs, businesses, schools, all the rest of it, farms. So they stayed, did not go back to Jerusalem, right? And the story takes place in the days of King Ahasuerus, probably King Xerxes, to give him his better-known Greek name. And it tells a story of how the Jews were almost exterminated, almost annihilated, something like nearly 500 BC, almost like a Holocaust way back before the Second World War, which I guess gives us the clue that not only was God hidden, but probably also Satan was involved here, behind the scenes, trying to orchestrate the destruction of the Jewish people. So in chapter 1, we had, if you remember, the festivities. King Ahasuerus runs an extraordinarily long banquet. At one point, he asks for Queen Vashti, his queen, to come out and parade herself to demonstrate how beautiful his queen was, and she said, "Get lost." So, oops, so she's banished, right? Chapter 1, Queen Vashti is banished, which, by a happy coincidence, creates a vacancy for a new queen of the Persian Empire. In chapter 2, we see how this works out because the counselors, advisors of the king say, "What you need, O king, is a beauty parade. Let's find the most beautiful, charming young women in the entire Persian Empire, and you choose the one that's best for you." And of course, lo and behold, that turns out to be Esther. And so we get to the story of Esther. She is beautiful, probably quite fortunate that she's beautiful, not some plain Jane. So she ends up being selected, rather remarkably, by the king. Now, he's got, by the sound of it, nearly 400 beautiful young women, according to tradition at least. It just happens that Esther is the most beautiful. Well, perhaps she was. Maybe she was. But even if she wasn't the absolutely most beautiful, she receives unusual favor with the king, and he selects Esther, whom he does not know at this stage is a Jewish young woman. Esther's cousin is Mordecai. So Mordecai and Esther play big roles in this particular story. Mordecai, we discover by accident, just happens to find out there's a plot to assassinate King Ahasuerus. So Mordecai, being a good guy, passes the story on to Esther. She passes it on to the king. King checks it out. It's legit. The two plotters are disposed of. But unusually, remarkably, coincidentally at this stage, the king forgets, overlooks to reward Mordecai. And it turns out that happens to have a big part to play as the story develops. Then we get the story of Haman, boo hiss, the nasty Haman, the enemy, who is affronted that Mordecai will not bow and scrape before him. So rather remarkably, rather than just deciding to deal with Mordecai, Haman decides, you know what? I'm going to wipe out all Jewish people, all of them. Young men, young women, babies, infants, old men, old women, everybody. Now this surely has to be, Satan at work through Haman, seeking to destroy the entire Jewish people of that day. And maybe Satan thought, if I destroy all the Jews here across the entire empire, good chance I'll nip in the bud the prophecies about Messiah coming from the house of David through the tribe of Judah. Maybe I can cancel God's plan. Oh, that might have been some of the thinking there. Now, Haman casts lots with his advisors, Purim, right? And lo and behold, by a question of just good luck, it so happens that the date that comes out of the rolling of the dice is 11 months in the future. Now, coincidence? Possibly. But obviously it would have been tricky if the date had been just perhaps 6 weeks in the future. Wouldn't give you much time to, get things sorted out. But 11 months away, that gives plenty of time for other coincidences to take place. And so it's announced to the entire empire that on X date, at the end of the year, all Jews are to be massacred. Which is rather stunning, of course, to the Jews, and probably rather stunning to most people who thought, well, these Jewish people seem okay. They're good neighbours, good farmers, good retailers, good leather workers, good jewellers. What's the problem? But of course it was Haman trying to destroy, probably in Satan's behalf, the Jewish people. And of course, what can the Jews possibly do to defend themselves? They're a people living in exile. They don't have an army. They don't have a general. They have no leaders of that sort. So, toast. How's God going to save them? Well, of course, going back to chapter 1, the vacancy, when Queen Vashti disappears, replacing her with a charming young Jewish woman as queen of the Persian Empire, it all starts to lead towards deliverance to the Jewish people. So Mordecai, at this stage, gets a message to Queen Esther. You need to go to the king and ask for deliverance. And she points out, well, that's not as easy as you suggest, my cousin, because you can't just go to the king. If you just walk in uninvited and he's in a bit of a mood, you're dead. The only way you can survive is if he holds out this sort of scepter for you, and then he is showing he accepts your uninvited arrival in his court. She says, well, okay, I guess I'll have to do that. And Mordecai says, well, it might well be. Who knows whether you've come to the throne for just such a time as this. Maybe you're the right person in the right place at the right time, sort of providentially. And of course, we know she was. So she asks her cousin to ensure that all the Jews fast for 3 days, at which point she says she'll go in and see the king. And if he's in a bad mood and she loses her life, that's all I can do. And she does, and of course it turns out the king's in quite a good mood. So he holds out the scepter and says, come on, oh queen, I'll give you anything you want, up to half my kingdom, which is probably a bit of hyperbole, but he's certainly in a very good mood, very generous. What do you want? And Esther says, well, I'd really love you and Haman to come and enjoy a banquet, which I will offer tomorrow in my private quarters. So the king's quite delighted with that. And he turns up with Haman, and that's where we pick up the story. So let's open our book of Esther, where we left off last week, which will be chapter 5. and beginning in verse 9. So the story is that the banquet takes place, but Queen Esther doesn't actually make her request at the banquet. Now, maybe she planned a delay, because what she says is, please come again tomorrow, O king, and Mr. Haman. And fair enough, we'll be back tomorrow. Why was that delay of a day there? Was it just because she had second thoughts? Perhaps when push came to shove, she just lacked a little bit of courage? Was it deliberate delay? Whatever it was one of these happy coincidences, because it created a bit of space for another coincidence to take place. But let's pick up in verse 9, chapter 5. So Haman went out that day from this banquet with just the king and himself. And of course, Haman is an extremely proud and arrogant individual. He goes out with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, in the king's court area, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Well, he already was. He's already announced to the entire empire that on X date, at the end of the year, all Jews, including Mordecai, of course, are to be exterminated. But he's not prepared to wait, by the looks of it. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. He sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, all the ways in which the king had promoted him, how he advanced him above the officials and servants of the king, because Haman was at the top. He's at the top of the totem pole. There's nobody higher in the kingdom than the king. So he's really proud and impressed with his might and his grandeur, and he's recounting that to his family and his friends. But, verse 12, moreover, Haman said, besides, in addition to all of that fame, Queen Esther, invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she prepared. And tomorrow, I'm invited by her along with the king again. I mean, what honors! What an incredible man I must be to have this level of honor and majesty. Isn't it wonderful? Yet, verse 13, all this avails me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai, that despicable Jew, sitting at the king's gate. It means nothing. I can't think of anything but this horrible Jew. Right? Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows be made, 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then, job done. Go merrily with the king to the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. This is a wonderful idea. I'm going to wait till the end of the year and get rid of this guy like tomorrow. So that's what I'll do. Great thinking, team. I'll go and see the king and just say, can we get rid of Mordecai, this horrible Jew? Now, the odds are that if it had just happened as you might have thought the story would develop, the king would probably have said, yeah, fair enough. I mean, this is Haman. This is his prime minister. This is his leader. He's already signed off the king as the extermination of 1 million or 2 or 3 million Jews. Not going to have a problem with signing off the killing of just one Jew. If Haman says this guy's a troublemaker and really dodgy and better off if we dispose of him today, the king's going to say, yeah, fair enough, take care of it. Don't bother me, I've got more important things to do. All right? That's probably what would have happened. Probably. But then another strange, remarkable coincidence just happens to occur. So let's read of that in chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. That night, the king could not sleep. That night, right? The king can't sleep. Now, why can't he sleep? Right? Well, because one has to imagine, you could speculate that perhaps the angel Gabriel's there invisibly and poking him in the rib cage as he tries to drop off. Every time King Ahasuerus rolls over, poke, poke, poke. I can't seem to get comfortable. Poke, poke, poke. What's wrong with me tonight? Poke, poke, poke. Right? So for some reason, just happens that this particular night, which is a key night in the story, the king suffers from insomnia. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the chronicles of the kings of Persia, and they were read before the king. Well, again, bit of a coincidence, because you could have done other things. You could have switched on the TV and watched a rerun of Gunsmoke. You could have perhaps put on the radio and listened to some country and western music, right? Whatever else you do in those days. But he decides, you know what? I'd rather like to hear about the chronicles, the tales of myself and earlier kings of Persia. Bring out the chronicles and read them to me. Well, that's just a helpful choice in terms of delivering the Jews. And it was found, verse 2, written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So, another coincidence. They open up all these scrolls of the past, 50 years of Persian history, and it just so happens that very quickly they land on the story of Mordecai. They could have missed that story, jumped over it, but they get there, and of course the king says, I remember that. Yeah, Mordecai, he told me about these two assassins plotting my death, and it was right, and we dealt with them. And remind me, what do we do for Mordecai? Verse 3, the king said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? The king's servants said, well, actually, looks like we did nothing. Can't imagine why. And of course you can't imagine why, other than it was another remarkable coincidence, because now the king's lying awake at night and he has to have the chronicles read out, and he finds out about Mordecai, right? And just a matter of an hour or two away, Haman's going to be heading towards the king's court to ask for Mordecai's execution. The king's now saying, what, we did nothing? This guy saved my life, and oh wow, that's really bad form, guys. Verse 4, and the king said, well, who's in the court? What wise people have I got at call? Now Haman, strangely enough, just Haman, had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he prepared for him. It says hanging a gallows. This appears to be more about him being impaled in those days on a sharp pole rather than hanging from your neck. The king's servant said to him, well, Haman's there just standing in the court. The king said, well, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king asked him, Haman, what should be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, well, hang on, bound to be me, right? Whom would the king delight to honor more than me? I mean, I'm your man. And Haman answered the king, oh, for the man whom the king delights to honor, here are my suggestions, O king. Let a royal robe be brought on which the king has worn, and a horse in which the king has ridden, which has the royal crest placed on its head. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, very important man, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, thus shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Obviously thinking he's your man, right? If you look at the sort of the rewards that Haman outlines here, there's nothing here about property or money. It doesn't say, well, you should give the guy a ranch with 5,000 head of cattle and camels and things. He should be given, lots of gold and jewelry. It's all about admiration, because Haman thinks he's the man and he wants more admiration. I've got to have a robe that the king would wear. I've got to ride on the king's horse. I'm going to be taken around the city square and people shout, hallelujah, hallelujah, what a mighty man. It's all to do with pride, arrogance, self-importance. You think perhaps you ought to have read Proverbs 16:18, which we're not turning to, but Proverbs 16:18 says, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall, because that's precisely what happens to your man. He's proud and haughty, and the fall is almost instantaneous. Because look at verses 10 through 14. And the king said to Haman, fantastic. Hasten, take the robe and the horse, as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai, the Jew, who sits in the king's gate. Leave nothing undone that you have spoken. Oh dear. So here's Haman about to say, execute Mordecai, and now Haman has to take all these wonderful gifts and take them to that despicable Jew, and I've got to lead that despicable Jew around the city as people shout, hallelujah to Mordecai. I'm doomed. So Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king wants to honor. Right? You can just imagine the guy's, he's about to throw up because he's gone from being the man to now bringing this horrible Jew along that the king utterly delights to honor. I can't ask the king to execute this guy because he's the most honorable man there in the city. Afterward, Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hastened to his house, mourning and with his head covered. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men, his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. It's almost like a little prophecy. And while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. Right? Because time had passed, the king's now ready to go off. He's done his good duty there to Mordecai, made him famous and given him a really wonderful experience. Now the king thinks, oh yeah, Queen Esther's got this banquet. Go get Haman. Bring him here. We're going to go off and see the queen for the second wine banquet. Read that in verse chapter 7. Let's read verses 1 through 4. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. I suspect Haman's appetite had fled. And on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. What is your request up to half my kingdom? It shall be done. So a very generous offer, and I think this is the third time. So there's no way that King Ahasuerus is going to make an offer 3 times without pretty much he's going to comply with his generous offer. And Queen Esther's had such favour, such grace in his eyes. It's quite a generous offer. Probably not literally half the kingdom, but pretty generous, right? The Queen Esther answered and said, if I have found favour in your sight, O king, if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated, exterminated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. So she says, save me, O king, my great husband, my great king. My life is forfeit. I'm going to be killed. So you can only imagine what King Ahasuerus is thinking. What? You're the queen. You're my wife. You're my favourite woman. Who's planning to kill you? What is this? The King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, who is he? Where is he who would dare presume in his heart to kill my wife? Point him out to me. Of course, Haman at this point is probably thinking, this doesn't sound good. Verse 6, Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. So Haman was terrified before the king and queen, and rightly so. Because, of course, he didn't know she was a Jewish girl. Right? Otherwise, he would have been probably playing a different game here. Remember, Esther's name means star in Persian, but Esther in Hebrew comes from a root meaning something hidden or something concealed. And up to this point in time, of course, Esther's nationality had been concealed. Now Haman finds out, oh, she's Jewish. The king's wife and queen is Jewish, and I've arranged to have all Jews executed, including the king's lovely, young, precious, beautiful wife, I'm in serious trouble. The king arose, verse 7, in wrath. Because, he'd just be utterly affronted. How could anybody plan to kill my wife? He might do it, as king, but nobody else has got that right. So the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and stormed into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. He knows that's it. He's out, he's finished, his goose is cooked. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, "Will he assault the queen while I'm even in the house?" And as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. So, king storms off in anger, doesn't know what to do, stabbing somebody. And he walks around the garden a few times and he comes back to deal with the situation, try and figure out what to do. And at that point, of course, Haman is bent over, pleading with Queen Esther, "Save me, save me, save me," and falls over onto her. So when the king walks into the room, there's Queen Esther on the couch, Haman lying on top of her, probably trying to untangle his arms and legs, and it looks like he's attacking her. The king thinks, what? He wants to kill all the Jews. He's killing my wife in front of my eyes. Get this guy out of here. And of course it says they put something over Haman's face, because I think the rule was that the king couldn't look on the face of a horrible criminal. So you just cover his face up so the king can't see that horrible face any longer. Now, of course, it's just a coincidence, clearly, that Haman falls over Esther just as the king is coming back in the door, right? Because if they'd been separate, maybe the king might have said, "Run this past me again. What's this whole story? I didn't know you were a Jewish girl, Esther." But of course, when he comes in and sees wrestling on the couch, that's it. Haman is finished at that point. Jewish tradition says that Gabriel was in the room at the time, invisible, of course, and probably keeping an eye out, looking for the king to come back. As the king approaches the door, Gabriel just shoves Haman over onto the couch. Probably not the case, but then again, who are we to say? It's all invisible, it's all hidden, right? But of course, the end result is that's Haman finished. Let's read verses 9 and 10. Now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, "Look, when I went to get Haman this morning, there's gallows there. Gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai. Mordecai that we just, honored. Haman made gallows for your favorite man, Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf. That's standing at the house of Haman." The king said, "We'll hang him on it." So they hanged, or impaled, Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. And then the king's wrath subsided. Got rid of that scumbag, right? How dare he plot against my queen? What is the man thinking of? So Haman is now left the picture. and really it would have been good if Haman had understood certain scriptures, so we'll keep our place there. But just look at Psalms 7, verses 14 to 16, because there's an important lesson that I think we all need to bear in mind. Psalms 7 and verses 14 through 16. Psalm 7:14. "Behold, the wicked travails with iniquity, conceives trouble, brings forth falsehood. He has made a pit and dug it out, and has fallen into the ditch which he has made. His trouble shall return upon his own head, and his violent dealing shall come down on his own crown." If you dig a pit, scripturally, there's a good chance you'll fall into it. You're laying a trap for somebody, don't be surprised if it comes back and traps you. This is a scriptural principle. I don't imagine any of us, hopefully, ever lay traps for people, but you might sometimes see that around you in your own experience, people at work, maybe even family somewhere, that they deliberately lay a trap for somebody and it comes back and bites them on the bahookie, right? Look at Proverbs 26:27. There's other scriptures we could look at, just a couple here. Proverbs 26 and 27. If Haman had learned not to dig a big pit, not to dig a big ditch for somebody else, it says here, Proverbs 26 and 27, whoever digs a pit will fall into it. He who rolls a stone, like up a hill, will find it rolling back down over him and be crushed by the stone he's trying to use as a weapon. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it. That's a scriptural lesson, and I think Haman's a good example. He dug a pit for the Jewish people. He dug a pit for Mordecai, and what happens? He's dead. He fell into his own trap, into his own ditch. So that's, Haman dealt with, but there's still a problem because the order to destroy the Jews as a people still applies. So let's read chapter 8 and verses 1 through 17. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. The house being not just the little building, the house being the property, the possessions, the farms, the wealth of Haman's business empire. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. Well, that's quite impressive for the king. This is the guy that saved my life, so to speak. And it turns out he's a cousin to, my wife. Oh, wonderful. So he's quite happy. So the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. So Mordecai becomes now just about the most important man in the Persian Empire below the king. Just like Joseph was the most important man in Egypt under the Pharaoh, and Daniel was sort of the most important Jewish man in Babylon under the Nebuchadnezzar and so on. So here we've got another Jewish guy who's now the most important man in a Gentile, if we can use that expression properly, empire, right? Quite impressive, really. Now, we can see here there's all these coincidences have led to the death of Haman, the architect of the destruction of the Jews. So you can see, I think, almost certainly how God is invisibly behind the scenes moving his pieces across the chessboard to ensure deliverance, but he himself never turns up anywhere. It's really quite remarkable. Now Esther, verse 3, spoke again to the king, fell down at his feet, and implored him with tears to counteract the evil plot of Haman the Agagite, and the scheme which he had devised against the Jews. So the king held out his golden scepter toward Esther, so accepted her approach. Esther arose and stood before the king and said, if it pleases the king, if I have found favour in his sight, and the thing seems right to the king, I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my own family, my own kindred? All right? So you recollect, a law of the Medes and Persians can't just be simply revoked. You can't say, well, just tear that up and throw it away. That's how Daniel ended up in the lion's den, because the king couldn't undo the law of the Medes and Persians. But of course, that doesn't stop you issuing another edict which allows you to do something about the first edict, and that's what takes place. Verse 7, then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, indeed, I have given Esther the house of Haman. They have hanged or impaled him on the gallows because he tried to lay hands on the Jews. You yourselves write a decree for the Jews as you please. In the king's name, in my name, Ahasuerus, seal it with the king's signet ring, which is a symbol of authority. For a letter which is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke. So the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, and it was written, according to all that Mordecai commanded, to the Jews, the satraps, the governors, the princes of the provinces, from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all, to every province in its own script, to every people in their own language, to the Jews in their own script and language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed it with the king's signet ring, sent letters by couriers on horseback, riding on royal horses bred from swift steeds, because you've got a long way to go. I mean, to get from Shushan in modern-day Iran across to India by horseback, it's quite a way, right? Got to get this message out to north and south and east and west. And by these letters, verse 11, the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions if you're assaulted. If they come after you, you can do something. You can't do something on your own. There's no permission here to go out and initiate any attacks. As we'll see, it's purely self-defense. If you're assaulted, you can defend, and you can defend to the point of killing. So let's read that again. Any province that would assault them, both little children and women, to plunder their possessions on one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus on the 13th day of the 12th month, that special day, which is the month of Adar. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province, published to all people, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves of their enemies. And the couriers, went out and hastened and pressed on by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Shushan, the citadel. Now Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad, because we can defend ourselves. The Jews had light and gladness, joy and honour, and in every province and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness and feast and a holiday. And many of the people of the land became Jews, because fear of the Jews fell upon them. So here's an important distinction to draw here. The Jews are not allowed to go out and attack. They are simply allowed to defend themselves, and on one day only. They can't run it over several weeks. They can't start early. They can't carry on any later. It's one day, but this is the decision of Mordecai, and I think Esther as well, on behalf of the king, that if you're attacked, you Jews anywhere, if you're attacked on that day, you can defend yourselves to the death, right? But only in that day. It's not something that can be, sort of protracted. You can't have vigilantes out there hunting down people that you don't like and killing them. This is very carefully controlled. It's not like the Hatfield and the McCoys, who famous American, that would be Americans, wouldn't they? Oh, sorry, shouldn't say that. But, were busy fighting each other for decades over who knows what not. You can't do that. This is one day only, right? And we just want to leave there chapter 8 and verse 9, which reads, so the king's scribes were called, blah, 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 blah. That is the longest verse in the Bible. So if you're ever in a pub, doing a pub quiz, which you probably won't be, but in this country, in Britain, we do have occasional pub quizzes. You put in your pound to participate, and you get a whole bunch of questions, most of which I can't answer these days. Who's the famous lead in the TV program XYZ and all that sort of stuff. Who was famous in 1968 with the song. I generally don't get many of those right. But if somebody said to you in a pub quiz, what's the longest verse in the Bible, you would say, oh, it's Esther, chapter 8, verse 9. Right? That's it. That's the longest verse in the Bible. And the corresponding shortest verse would be John 11:35, where it says, Jesus wept. That's the shortest verse in the English Bible, English translation of the Bible. There is a shorter verse if you go by the original Greek. So there we are. That's where we are. If we move on to chapter 9, we'll see how things play out. So let's read verses 1 through 10.
You should have a quiz next week.
Have a quiz next week. What's the shortest verse in the Bible? What's the longest verse in the Bible? What's the middle verse in the Bible? What's the middle word in the Bible? You get all of that on Google if you go looking. Chapter 9, verses 1 through 10. Now in the 12th month, so, the time's now elapsed, we've come to the date that Haman had determined by casting the lots, the Purim, right? And this is it. In the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, On the 13th day, the time came for the king's command and his decree, the first command and decree, to be executed. On the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. The Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. Remember, defense only. That's all, defense only. If somebody's seeking your harm, you can kill them, right? But you can't go looking for them first. And no one could withstand the Jews because fear of them fell upon all people. Again, behind the scenes, this air of anxiety and fear coming across a lot of people. And all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, governors, all those doing the king's work, helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them, because Mordecai is now one of the most famous people in the Persian Empire. And he's a Jew. A lot of people respect him and like him. For Mordecai was great in the king's palace. His fame spread throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai became increasingly prominent. How? Why? How did he get such favour? Isn't that remarkable? Well, not really. Not because behind the scenes, helping things along. Thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. Self-defense. In Shushan, the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, amongst them Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Arisai, Aridai, and Vajezatha, the 10 sons of Haman. So his sons were still there, and no doubt when the time came they thought maybe vengeance, get our own back. If we get enough bodies with us, we can attack according to the first edict of the king. We can go and destroy the Jews, Mordecai in particular, but it's not going to work. So the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, they killed. But they did not lay a hand on the plunder. They weren't after, the property of these people. They were defending their lives against, a Holocaust back in those days. And so this brings us essentially to the institution of the festival of Purim. So on this one day, self-defense, lots of folk killed, several tens of thousands. In Shushan itself, Queen Esther asked for one more day. She said to the king, look, we've done a pretty good job today, but here in the center, here in Shushan, this is where Haman's family is, his sons and others. This is really the hotbed of the plot against the Jews. I think we need one more day here just to make sure we get rid of all of them. So the king says, okay, one more day. So in Shushan, 2 days were taken to eradicate the troublemakers. The rest of the empire, just the one day. So let's pick up the story in chapter 9, verses 17 to 22. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar. On the 14th day of the month, the people around the empire rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness on the 14th of Adar. So they defended themselves on the 13th, saw off the enemy for that one day alone. And the next day, the 14th, is a day of festival, rejoicing and gladness because we survived. We've seen off our enemies. We've got peace ahead of us now. But the Jews who were in Shushan, the center, assembled together on the 13th day as well as on the 14th day, that extra day that Esther asked for. And on the 15th day of the month, they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. So most people, the 14th, folk in the Shushan, it was the 15th that was their festival day. Therefore, the Jews of the villages who dwelt in the unwalled towns celebrated the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day of gladness and feasting, as a holiday, and for sending presents to one another. Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly on the 14th and 15th of the month of Adar as the days in which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as a month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them, from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So Mordecai says, this is it. From now on these 2 days, it's going to be a holiday. You send gifts to people who might be poor, you dress up, you have fun, it's party time because we've been saved, delivered. Verses 26 to 32. So they called these days Purim, after the name Pur, meaning, a lot. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter, what they had seen concerning this matter and what had happened to them, the Jews established and imposed it upon themselves and their descendants and all who should join them, that without fail they should celebrate these 2 days every year according to the written instructions and according to the prescribed time. So it's instituted as a permanent holiday because of the incredible deliverance which took place, even though you don't see God's hand directly anywhere, yet how else could it have happened? That these days, verse 28, should be remembered and kept throughout every throughout every generation, every family, every province, every city, that these days of Purim should not fail to be observed among the Jews, and that the memory of them should not perish among their descendants. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim, so the queen gets involved as well. Mordecai, who's like prime minister essentially, writes out and says to the Jews, you got to do this. Everybody does this every year without fail. We need to remember this remarkable event and all these incredible coincidences. Queen Esther says, too true. Queen Esther, verse 29, the daughter of Abihail with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim, and Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim at their appointed time, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had prescribed for them, as they had decreed for themselves and their descendants concerning matters of the fasting and lamenting. So the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. So it goes out to the whole Persian Empire. The Jews must keep these days. And we'll just finish off with chapter 10, verse 3. Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus, was great among the Jews, well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people, speaking peace to all his kindred. So he remained, a very important man. Now, of course, the festival of Purim is still kept today, as it should be. You can see there, it's pretty much binding on the Jewish people, if they get any real respect for their history, to observe this day as a day of, what it is. If you can Google it, stick in, Purim on Google or whatever search engine you use, stick on videos and you'll see some horrible stuff, got to say. There's a lot of fun. People dress up in costumes, fancy dress. There is dancing, there's music, there is feasting and partying. It looks like one of the most fun-filled days among, Jewish populations around the world. And they give gifts, to poor people. It's all, pretty good. I think nowadays it looks a bit outlandish at times. That's because we're in, 2019. We don't do things sensibly any longer. So there's a lot of tomfoolery goes on as well. It's traditional, I think, most Jewish communities to read the book of Esther. I think sometimes even twice in the feast or the festival of Purim, right? And it sounds like it's quite good fun because as you read through out loud, it might be the synagogue leader or whatever reads out loud the book of Esther. Then when you get to the name of Haman, then you hiss, boo, or there's sort of rattles, rattle, or you stamp your feet, just to sort of show how much you despise the nasty Haman character. So it sounds like good fun, and it's still observed today. Next year, the festival of Purim takes place next year, 2020. It takes place on the 10th of March. Obviously, Jewish calendar begins the night before the evening of the 9th of March. And people ask, would Jesus have kept the festival of Purim? I think the answer would be yes, because it looks like it's binding on the Jewish people, right? For every generation, for all time, pretty much what the decree says there. And let me ask you, who was the hidden God during the book of Esther? Who was moving these pieces around? Who was ensuring that Queen Vashti got pushed out? Who was ensuring that Esther got selected? Who was ensuring that Mordecai overheard this plot to assassinate the king? Who was the hidden God? when it became Jesus Christ. So it wouldn't be a great surprise if he was keeping it. Why wouldn't he when he was on the earth? In fact, some people say that the unnamed festival in John chapter 5 verse 1, which we're not turning to, just says the feast of the Jews arrived. But some people say that that was probably the festival of Purim. You can't say that for sure. Some people say it was Feast of Tabernacles, some say it was Pentecost, some do say it was Purim. But I think almost certainly the case that Jesus would have kept it. If he's the hidden God that delivered the Jews at that time, why wouldn't he keep it? Probably smiling to himself as he heard some of the tales and stories and saw the people dressing up and having a good time. He'd be thinking, oh yeah, I remember how we worked that out at the time and how Gabriel pushed over Haman onto Esther's lap. Oh, I remember that. Pretty good move by Gabriel. I'm sure Jesus kept it. It's a great story. The book of Esther is a great story. And yet, we find that, curiously, God is not directly mentioned. And yet you think of all the sort of a coincidences that took place. Queen Vashti, first of all, being deposed. Okay, that's just a coincidence, right? It creates a vacancy, but that was just a coincidence. That can happen at any time, anywhere. Then, of course, you have the beauty parade, right? And it just so happens that a young Jewish woman named Esther, or Hadassah, turns out to be, just happens that she's the one selected by the king. Oh, what if she had an outbreak of acne at the time? What if she had terrible bad breath? Flies died when they flew in front of her. Just happens that she's beautiful, and charming, and delicate, and wonderful, and she's the one. What about the chances of a Jewish girl becoming the Queen of Persia? What's the chances of that happening? What's the chance of Mordecai coming to know about a plot to assassinate the king? It just so happens that Mordecai, Esther's cousin, a Jew, finds out and passes the message along. It just so happens that the king forgets to reward a man who saved his life. It would be the most natural thing to do, to arrange for some reward for this guy, but somehow, in the big scheme of things, he gets lost, right? Haman casts these lots, these Purim, and it just so happens that it's a long way off before the date of the destructions to happen, giving plenty of time for other things to happen. Queen Esther has to go to the king and try and ask him about delivering her people. He's in a bad mood that day. He's had toothache through the night, terrible stomach ache from that curry he ate the night before, and take it away and kill her. But no, he's great. But come on, Queen, come on. Anything you want, up to half my kingdom. Oh, it's wonderful to see you again, right? Then Esther has this banquet with the king and Haman, and rather than just saying, this is what I need, she says, come back tomorrow, please, O king and Haman. So, a delay of a day. Why? Was that deliberate? Was that something God just dropped into her mind? Because that creates room for another coincidence. The king suffers from insomnia. What's the chance of that very night? He calls for the Chronicles. The Chronicles are opened to the page that records Mordecai's help in seeing off an assassination attempt. The king, what do we do? Well, ask Haman. So it all works together. And of course, when Haman seeks the help of Esther, he just falls over on top of her. Just at the moment the king walks in the door and sees, I can't believe this guy. In my palace, this guy is attacking my queen in front of my take this man out of here. Right? It all works out just perfectly. And you can see, in a sense, that surely there are too many coincidences here for just luck. Maybe one, right? Maybe two or three, but not what might be 20 plus remarkable coincidences, which just basically bring us to the salvation, the deliverance of the Jewish people. And the point from that really is, as we said last week, is when you and I are looking for God in our lives, we shouldn't discount the fact that coincidence is sometimes God's way of remaining anonymous, as Einstein said. So here there's no reference to God directly. His name isn't mentioned. No prophet turns up with a message, thus saith the Lord. It's just things just work out, but they work out incredibly, helpfully. showing that God can and does work invisibly, behind the scenes, moving things about, and sometimes you and I need eyes to see. You may think, that's a coincidence where that happened. Was that just a coincidence? Or was there something here that like God was involved? An early example in my life, which at the time I knew was coincidence, but equally I knew it was a special coincidence. I was 15 at the time. I'd been reading the church literature for a few months. I'd come to the conclusion that the Sabbath was to be kept. It seemed fairly obvious. I was a Catholic at the time, keeping Sundays for at least 1 hour anyway, going to Mass. But it was evident that, Sabbath. All right. It's in the Ten Commandments, and it's here at Exodus 16, and it's, dear me. Oh, well, that's pretty good. Oh, I've got a problem, which I had got a problem. I was 15, living at home. I had a Saturday job. It's quite common, I think, among many people in those days, young boys in particular. My job as a Saturday boy was to cycle a butcher's bicycle around the town I lived in, delivering packages of butcher meat to people. So customers would order a pound of mince, 2 steaks, whatever it might be, packaged, address written on, in a great big pannier in front of the bicycle. And my job on Saturday mornings was to sort of pedal around the town, several trips backwards and forwards to the butcher's shop, and hand over all this butcher meat. And I got paid a small amount of money for that, which was in lieu of pocket money and stuff like that. Saturdays. How can I, because this is tricky. I'm living at home, 15. I was expected to work by my dad, who expected you to work for your living. Even at 15, I'd been working since I was 10 in various jobs. How can I get out of, I don't know. I can't simply say I'm not going to work on Saturdays. That would have been a major problem, I would have thought. So I was thinking, how can I get time to keep the Sabbath, and how will that go down in the family? So I was up on a Friday night, as it happens, about 6:30 in the evening, and was praying. And literally the prayer was, Father in heaven, I want to keep your Sabbath. I can see it's there in Scripture. I'd love to do it. I don't know how to get out of my Saturday job because, it's going to cause warfare in the family. I'm supposed to be earning money to keep myself. This is going to be a major problem. What can be done about this? And I was busy praying, and literally whilst praying, the doorbell went downstairs, and my mum answered the door, and then I got shouted down the stairs, and lo and behold, in front of me is the manager of the butcher's shop where I worked on Saturday mornings. And he said, very sorry, some problems in the butcher's shop. A couple of the guys that are full-time employees there, be young guys, pretty silly young guys, been playing with knives and machetes, and somebody's been caught by somebody else, and there was an investigation, and they decided that they want to bring more control into the butcher's shop. So I'm afraid all the Saturday boys are being let off. Your job is cancelled. You can't work on Saturday any longer. So thank you for your help in the past, but sorry. And he turned around and went away. I thought, hang on. I'm just praying upstairs 5 minutes ago saying, Father, help me to find a way not to have to go to work on Saturday so I can keep your Sabbath. I want to do it. Please help me, please help me, please help me. And literally, the doorbell goes ding dong. Your Saturday job's finished. What? So, I was delighted. I expressed, my mum and dad, sorry, there's apparently trouble at the butcher's, and I've been laid off, and c'est la vie. And I thought, there's going to be a bit of pressure now to get another Saturday job. But would you believe it? Never arose. Nobody ever asked another question. Nobody said, isn't it time you got another job? Just all right, peaceful and quiet. And from that time, back in 1965, I think it was, I've been able to keep the Sabbath. And I knew at the time, I said, well, that's going to be a great coincidence that I'm praying about keeping the Sabbath and how to avoid my Saturday job. And at that very moment, the doorbell goes with a guy saying, you don't have to come any longer. In fact, you better not come any longer. How could that happen? That's an incredible coincidence. But I thought, no, it's more than that. That's an answer to prayer coming as a coincidence. And I think if you look at your life, if I look at my life in other areas, you can probably think, you know what? That was too special, that coincidence. I reckon that's the hidden hand of God in my life there. And I think also there and there. You have to look for it. You know, we need ears to hear and eyes to see. But you look around, I think you'll find there's some just unusual circumstances. One other one I think I mentioned before, a couple in the church in Birmingham, Alex, Elizabeth, both dead now, so they won't mind me giving their names. They were driving to the Feast of Tabernacles, took a shortcut through the countryside in England and got lost. This was quite a long time ago, before sat nav was around, so they were lost in the middle of the countryside. Like, where are we? The car stopped; it wouldn't go. It had broken down, and Alex wasn't a particularly good engineer. He was a very nice guy, and his wife was a very nice lady. I know she kept a lot of cats. Went to her house once, and I said, "Well, all the cats all over me." Well, that you're sitting in Tiddle's chair. That's why the cats are crawling all over you. There's a lot of cats there, a lot of cat smell there. Anyway, so they broke down middle of the country, and Alex got out and put the bonnet up, or I think the hood you might call in America, and he looks at, like, he's not an engineer, not a car mechanic. He just, I don't know, wiggle something else, and it doesn't start. And he said, just at that moment, this guy standing beside him who says, "I have come to help you." And Alex always said afterwards, it was the phrasing that really struck him. He didn't say, "Can I try to help you? Would you like me to have a look on your behalf?" He said, "I have come to help you." I was thinking, where'd he come from? Because in the middle of a country road, there's no houses, no town anywhere. Where'd he come from? And the guy says, "Get back into the car." And Alex gets back into the driver's seat. "Try it now." Brum, 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 brum. Fantastic. Gets out of the car. Where's the guy? Literally disappeared. So Alex and Elizabeth both were convinced after that, and you couldn't convince them otherwise. This was an angel. The guy just turns up. "I have come to help you." Not, "Let's see if I can do something." The car is fixed. They carry on their way. Didn't see the guy arriving. Didn't see him departing. Now you could say, well, that's just a coincidence. You know, a very experienced car mechanic was just walking invisibly down the road and saw the car, and Alex misunderstood. The man actually said, "I'll try my best to see if I can do something for you." And then when Alex came out of the car to thank him, 1 second after the car started, the guy just coincidentally wandered over the horizon and away. Yeah. Coincidence? Yeah, maybe, but almost certainly the hand of God involved. In this case, one imagines an angel. Okay, long story short, Book of Esther, very good for telling us about the hidden hand of God in our lives. And that can be, I think, at times very encouraging. Okay, with that, we'll conclude today's message.